Jake Ellison sat in the back row of the Great Chamber on Athvera, the capital world of the Galactic Council. He had been sitting in that same seat for 3 years, not because he liked it, but because no one ever offered him a better one. The chamber was enormous, shaped like a half-moon, filled with delegates from over 100 species. The air smelled like a dozen different atmospheres mixed together, filtered through machines that hummed so quietly you forgot they were there. Machines that human engineers had installed 60 years ago. A Thailand delegate named Vorat stood at the central podium. He was tall, gray-skinned with 4 eyes that never seemed to blink. He was talking about resource allocation for the outer systems, and somewhere in the middle of his speech he made a joke. He said the council should simply ask the humans to handle it, since they seemed to enjoy being the galaxy's janitors. The chamber laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Jake watched the laughter ripple across the room like a wave, and he felt something inside him go very still. Not angry, just still. Like the moment before you decide to put something down and never pick it up again. He left the chamber without saying a word. 6,000 light-years away, Commander Nate Caldwell stood on the bridge of the USS Starfall, a deep space carrier that had been patrolling the Fringe Corridor for the last 9 years. The Fringe was the most dangerous stretch of space in the known galaxy. Pirate fleets hid in its asteroid fields. Raider clans used its dark nebulae as staging grounds. Dozens of alien trade convoys passed through it every week, and every single one of them depended on human patrols to keep them alive. None of those species had ever once offered to help with the patrols. None of them had ever sent a ship to share the burden. Nate received the orders at 0300 ship time. They came through on a channel so encrypted it took the Starfall systems 4 minutes to decode. The message was short. It had a code name, Silent Tide, and a set of instructions that were so clear and so final that Nate read them twice just to be sure. He was to begin a full withdrawal of all human military assets from the Fringe Corridor. No announcements, no warnings, no goodbyes. He was to pull his ships out quietly over the course of 6 weeks and leave nothing behind. He stood there for a long time, staring at the message. Then he called his executive officer to the bridge and began. On the Dravari homeworld, a planet of red dust and pale green skies, Megan Holt was elbow-deep in a gene sequencer when her recall orders arrived. She had been living on that planet for 11 years, running a disease prevention lab that she had built from nothing. The Dravari were a proud species, tall and sharp-featured, and they had never once treated her as an equal. They used her research. They relied on her treatments. But they called humans slow and simple behind her back, and sometimes to her face. She had learned to let it go. She told herself the work mattered more than the insults. Her superior back on Earth, a man named Greg Dunham, delivered the news over a secure channel. She was to archive all of her research, transfer nothing to the local scientists, and board a transport within 72 hours. Megan felt her stomach drop. She told him she was in the middle of synthesizing an enzyme inhibitor that was keeping a respiratory plague under control. If she left, the synthesis would stop. People would die. Greg was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They never once said thank you, Megan. Not once in 11 years. But nothing came out, because she knew he was right. Across the galaxy, in hundreds of systems, on thousands of stations and planets, the same thing was happening. Human civilians packed their belongings and boarded transport ships. Human researchers closed their labs and wiped their databases. Human engineers powered down reactors they had built with their own hands, reactors that kept cities warm and hospitals running. Human doctors locked the doors of clinics they had funded out of their own budgets. They did it quietly. They did it without anger. They simply stopped, packed up, and left. No one noticed at first. That was the part that would haunt the galaxy later. No one noticed. On Athvera, Jake Ellison spent his last night in the human embassy. It was a small building on the edge of the diplomatic quarter, overshadowed by the towering embassies of the Thylon and the Melvari. He had always thought that was a fitting metaphor. He typed up humanity's formal withdrawal from the Galactic Council. It was 1 page long. He could have written more. He could have listed every insult, every slight, every time a human sacrifice was met with alien indifference. But he didn't. He kept it simple. 1 page. Clean and clear and final. He walked to the council's administrative office after hours, when the hallways were empty and the lights were dim. He placed the document on a desk. He did not sign it with ceremony. He did not slam it down. He just set it there, the way you might leave a note for someone who probably won't read it anyway. Then he walked back to the embassy, picked up his bag, and boarded the last shuttle leaving Athvera. Ambassador Rillis of the Quori found the document the next morning. The Quori were a small species, gentle and thoughtful, and Rillis had always been one of the few aliens who treated humans with genuine respect. She picked up the single page and read it. Then she read it again. Her hands began to tremble, not because of what the document said, but because of what it didn't say. There was no anger in it, no accusation, no demand. It was just a notification, a simple, quiet goodbye. She walked to the window of the administrative office and looked out at the sky above Athvera. Somewhere out there, human ships were already turning away, already pointing toward Ohm. She pressed her hand against the glass and felt something cold settle in her chest, the kind of cold that comes not from temperature but from understanding. She understood, perhaps before anyone else in the galaxy, that something terrible had just begun. Not because the humans had declared war, not because they had made threats or demands, but because they had said nothing at all. Silence, Rillis thought, was the loudest sound she had ever heard. 3 months after the humans left, the first convoy was destroyed in the Fringe Corridor. It was a Quori merchant fleet, 12 ships carrying grain and medical supplies to a colony on the far side of the nebula. They had made the same trip 40 times before, without incident, because every single time, a human patrol had been watching over them from the shadows, scanning for threats, chasing off raiders before they could get close. The Quori merchants never saw the human ships. They never knew they were there. They simply assumed the corridor was safe, the way a child assumes the house is warm, without ever thinking about who pays for the heat. The raiders hit them just past the Dremac asteroid belt. 6 pirate vessels came out of the dust cloud, fast and hard. And the Quori ships had no weapons, no shields worth mentioning, and no one to call for help. The distress signal went out on all frequencies. It echoed through empty space for 4 hours before it finally died. By then, all 12 ships were gone. 930 people, farmers and doctors and children who had done nothing wrong except travel through a stretch of space that used to be safe. Ambassador Rillis received the news in her office on Athvera. She sat behind her desk and stared at the report for a very long time. She did not cry. She was past crying. She picked up her communicator and tried, for the 11th time, to reach Earth through back channels. Every frequency she tried was met with the same thing, not static, not interference, silence, clean, deliberate, absolute silence, as if the humans had not just left the galaxy, but had erased their side of it entirely. High Coordinator Cephas of the Melvari was the first council official to understand the true size of the problem. Cephas was a bureaucrat, the kind of person who lived inside spreadsheets and logistics reports. And when the trade numbers for the quarter came in, he felt his blood go cold. Shipping volume across the Fringe Corridor had dropped by 80%. Fuel depots that humans had built and maintained along major routes were running dry, because no one knew how to resupply them. Communication relays that connected entire sectors of the galaxy were going offline one by one, their power cells dying, their software corrupted, their maintenance schedules ignored by species that had never bothered to learn how they worked. He ran a full audit. It took 2 weeks, and the results nearly broke him. Humans had been subsidizing almost 40% of the Council's entire logistical infrastructure. They had done it without contracts, without recognition, without asking for a single credit in return. They had simply seen things that needed doing and done them, year after year, decade after decade, while the rest of the galaxy looked the other way. Cephas brought his findings to High Chancellor Vorath. He laid the data on the table and waited. Vorath looked at it the way someone looks at a stain on their shirt, with mild irritation and no real concern. He told Cephas to find replacements. Cephas told him there were none. No other species had the engineering knowledge, the logistical capacity, or the willingness to do what the humans had done. Vorath waved his hand and said the Council would adapt. He said this with the confidence of someone who had never in his life had to fix anything himself. The galaxy did not adapt. On the Dravari homeworld, the plague came back. Megan Holt's enzyme inhibitor had been the only thing keeping it suppressed, and without her lab producing fresh batches every week, the existing supply ran out in less than a month. The first cases appeared in the capital city, then the southern provinces, then everywhere. The Dravari government scrambled to find someone who could replicate the treatment. But the formula was complex, built on 11 years of Megan's research she had been ordered to archive and take with her. The Dravari had never asked her to teach them. They had never asked to learn. They had simply used what she gave them and assumed it would always be there. Within 6 weeks, hospitals across the planet were overwhelmed. The Dravari ambassadors stood before the Council and begged for help. He was shaking. His voice cracked. He described children dying in hallways because there were no beds left. The chamber was quiet, but it was not the respectful quiet of sympathy. It was the uncomfortable quiet of people who knew they should do something, but had no idea what. No one could help. No one had the expertise. And then, as if the galaxy had decided to punish itself, the border between the Thylan and the Valesi caught fire. It had been a tense border for over a century. Two proud, militaristic species sharing a stretch of space rich in resources and short on patience. For 112 years, human diplomats had kept the peace. They had shuttled back and forth between the two capitals, translating not just languages, but intentions, calming tempers, finding compromises, doing the exhausting and thankless work of making sure two species who hated each other never quite hated each other enough to start shooting. The diplomats were gone now. There was no one left to translate, no one left to calm. A Thywan mining vessel crossed into disputed space and was fired upon by a Valesi patrol. The Thylan responded by sending warships. The Valesi matched them. Within 4 days, there were 100 ships facing each other across a line that had held for a century. And the only people who had ever known how to hold it were sitting on a porch somewhere on Earth, drinking coffee and watching the rain. Defense Minister Kravoth, Vorath's military advisor, had once called human fleets decorative. He had said this at a dinner party, and people had laughed, because it was easy to laugh at the species that did the hard work, while you drank wine and took credit. Kravoth was not laughing now. He was standing in the Council's war room, staring at a tactical display that showed the Thylan-Valesi border dissolving into chaos, and he had no idea what to do. Human commanders had written the playbook for every major peacekeeping operation in living memory. Kravoth had never read it. He had never thought he needed to. Vorath appeared on the Council's public broadcast that evening. He stood at the podium where he had once mocked the humans, and told the galaxy that their departure was irrelevant. He said the council was strong. He said the council would endure. He said these things with his 4 eyes staring straight into the camera. And across 1,000 worlds, people watched him and felt nothing but fear, because they could see what he refused to see. The machine was breaking. The gear was missing. And the sound it made as it ground itself apart was the sound of a galaxy learning too late what it had thrown away. Rillis watched the broadcast alone in her office. When it was over, she turned off the screen and sat in the dark. She thought about Jake Ellison, the quiet human who had placed a single page on a desk and walked away without a word. She thought about how small that gesture had seemed at the time, and how enormous it seemed now. She whispered into the dark room, to no one, "What have we done?" It never does. 8 months after the humans left, a woman named Katie Marsh sat alone in a small room on a neutral trading station called Outpost Ven, writing the most important article of her life. Katie was human. She was a journalist who had chosen to stay behind when everyone else went home. Not because she disagreed with the departure, but because she believed someone should witness what came next. She had rented a tiny compartment on the station, barely big enough for a bed and a desk, and she spent her days interviewing the aliens who passed through. Traders, refugees, soldiers on leave, ordinary people from a dozen species who were all, in their own way, trying to understand what had gone wrong with the galaxy. She had spoken to a Quori shopkeeper that morning, an old man with silver-blue skin and hands that shook when he talked. He had lived on a human space station for 20 years before the withdrawal. He sold fabric and thread, and his best customers had been human families. He told Katie that the humans used to fix things on the station, not because anyone asked them to, not because it was their job, but because they noticed when something was broken, and it bothered them to leave it that way. A flickering light in a hallway, a leaking pipe in the market, a bench with a cracked leg. They just fixed it. He said he never realized how much they did until they were gone, and everything started to break at the same time. Katie published the article that evening. She titled it simply, and the piece spread across alien networks faster than anything she had ever written. Within a week, it had been translated into 40 languages. Billions of beings read it. Many of them cried, not because the article was sad, but because it described something they recognized. They all had a version of that story. They all knew a human who had helped without being asked, and they had all taken it for granted. Back on Athvera, High Coordinator Cephas was buried in data, and every new number was worse than the last. His audit had expanded from logistics into infrastructure, and what he found terrified him. Human engineers had been quietly reinforcing the Council's core systems for decades. They had patched failing power grids, upgraded communication arrays, redesigned water purification networks, and reinforced structural supports on dozens of space stations. They had done all of this without filing reports, without requesting budgets, and without telling anyone. They just did it, the same way they fixed broken benches and leaking pipes, because it needed doing and no one else was going to do it. Now those patches were failing. A power grid on a Melvari station overloaded and blacked out an entire residential sector for 3 days. A communication array in the Korath system went offline, cutting 12 colonies off from the rest of the galaxy. A water purification plant on a Thylan border world began producing contaminated water because a filter that a human engineer had secretly upgraded 14 years ago had finally worn out, and no one even knew it existed until it stopped working. Cephas stood in his office and stared at a map of the galaxy. Red dots marked every system where human-maintained infrastructure was failing. There were so many red dots that parts of the map looked like they were bleeding. The war between the Thylon and the Valesi had grown into something monstrous. 6 star systems were now contested. Fleets clashed in the dark between worlds, and the casualties were no longer measured in hundreds, but in hundreds of thousands. The council voted to send a peacekeeping force, but when they tried to assemble one, they discovered something that should have been obvious, but somehow never was. Every major peacekeeping operation in the last 200 years had been led by human commanders, crewed by human soldiers, and coordinated by human strategists. The council had no one trained for it. They had no doctrine. They had no experience. They had let the humans do it all, every single time, and now they were standing in front of a fire with no idea how to put it out. Admiral Draven's show of the Valesi watched the disaster unfold from the bridge of his flagship. He was old enough to remember serving alongside human officers during the Krathian border crisis 30 years ago. He remembered a human captain named Sam Reeves who had defused a standoff between 2 fleets by flying his single ship into the gap between them and broadcasting on an open channel. Sam had talked for 6 hours straight, calm and steady, until both sides agreed to stand down. Draven had thought it was the bravest thing he had ever seen. He had also thought, at the time, that it was a very human thing to do. No other species would risk themselves like that for someone else's war. Now Draven studied the human military archives that had been left behind. They were sitting in the Council's database, untranslated and unread, ignored for centuries. He found tactical manuals, peacekeeping protocols, conflict resolution frameworks, and detailed analyses of every major engagement in the last 400 years. It was a treasure of knowledge that could have saved thousands of lives, and no one had ever opened it. No one had cared enough to look. On the Dravari homeworld, the plague had become a full pandemic. 2 billion people were infected, hospitals had collapsed, entire cities were under quarantine. The Dravari ambassador appeared before the council again, but this time he did not beg. He simply collapsed at the podium, weeping, unable to speak. The chamber watched in silence. Someone helped him to a chair. No one knew what to say, because there was nothing to say. The cure existed. Megan Holt had created it. But Megan Holt was gone, and she had taken her work with her, not out of spite, but because those were her orders. And because in 11 years, not a single Dravari had ever asked to learn what she knew. Vorath faced a no-confidence vote that afternoon. He survived it, but only barely. And only because he stood at the podium and did the one thing that cowards have always done when the world falls apart around them. He blamed someone else. He said the humans had abandoned their responsibilities. He said they had betrayed the galaxy's trust. He called them selfish and ungrateful. Rillis, sitting in her seat, listened to every word. When he was done, she stood up and said, quietly but clearly enough for the entire chamber to hear, that what Vorath had just said was the most delusional statement in the history of the Galactic Council. Then she sat down. The chamber was silent. That night, Katie Marsh received an anonymous transmission from the direction of Earth space. It was not addressed to anyone. It was not encrypted. It was just a single line of text, drifting through space like a message in a bottle. It read, "We didn't leave because we hated them. We left because they made it clear we were nothing, and we believed them long enough to finally agree." Katie read it 7 times. Then she turned off her terminal, lay down on her small bed, and stared at the ceiling of her tiny room on a station that was slowly falling apart, in a galaxy that was doing the same. 14 months after the humans departed, the galactic economy broke. It did not break the way a bone breaks, clean and sudden. It broke the way a bridge breaks, slowly at first, a groan here, a crack there, small pieces falling away while everyone standing on it tells themselves it will hold. And then, all at once, it doesn't. Trade across the galaxy had dropped by 60%. The shipping lanes that humans had built and maintained were degrading faster than anyone could repair them. Navigation beacons went dark. Fuel stations ran dry. Insurance companies refused to cover convoys through the fringe corridor, because the fringe corridor had become a graveyard. 3 species faced famine, because the food shipments they depended on could no longer reach them safely. 2 species, the Korath and the Selen, faced extinction-level resource shortages because the supply chains that kept their homeworlds alive had been routed through human-maintained corridors that no longer existed. On Athvera, the council met every day now, and every day the news was worse. The Phylum-Velasi war had turned into something no one could control. Both sides had deployed weapons that were banned under galactic treaties, weapons that burned atmospheres and poisoned oceans and left worlds uninhabitable for centuries. The treaties that banned these weapons had been negotiated by human diplomats. The enforcement mechanisms had been designed by human lawyers. Without either, the treaties were just words on a screen, and words on a screen had never stopped a war. Vorath was removed from power on a Tuesday. It was not a vote, it was not a legal process. A coalition of delegates from 9 species walked into the council chamber during a session, surrounded Vorath at the podium, and told him he was finished. There were no weapons, there was no violence. They simply stood around him, these representatives of worlds that were starving and burning and dying, and they looked at him with eyes that held nothing but contempt. Vorath tried to speak. One of the delegates, a Korai woman with white hair and steady hands, said, "You have spoken enough." He was escorted from the building and exiled from Athvera that same day. No one defended him. No one even looked at him as he left. Rilis was appointed interim chancellor. She did not want the position. She took it because someone had to, and because she was the only person left in the council who still had any idea what to do, even though what she had to do was the hardest thing she had ever faced. Her first act was to open a formal communication channel to Earth. She did not send a political message. She did not send a list of demands, or a diplomatic proposal, or a carefully worded statement drafted by a committee. She sat alone in her office, in front of a recording device, and she spoke from the heart for 11 minutes. She talked about a human doctor named Sam Reeves, who had come to the Korai homeworld 20 years ago during the Krethian flu outbreak. The outbreak had killed 80,000 Korai in 2 weeks, and the Korai medical system had been overwhelmed. Sam Reeves had flown in on a transport ship loaded with medicine and equipment that he had paid for himself. He worked for 40 days without rest, sleeping in hallways, eating whatever someone put in his hands, treating patients until his own hands shook from exhaustion. He saved over 12,000 lives. When it was over, the Korai government sent him a formal letter of thanks. It was 1 paragraph long. He never received anything else. Rilis talked about the human engineers who had rebuilt the Korai aqueducts after the great earthquakes. They had come with machines and materials and worked for 2 years in the dust and the heat. And when they were done, they refused payment. The project leader, a young woman with sunburned skin and tired eyes, had said, "You needed water. We knew how to get it to you. That's enough." Rilis paused in her recording. She looked directly into the lens and said, "We were ungrateful. We were blind. We saw what you gave us, and we told ourselves it was nothing. We told ourselves you were simple. That your kindness was weakness. We were wrong about all of it, and we are sorry. We are so deeply sorry." The message was sent. It traveled across the void toward Earth space at the speed of light. Days passed, then weeks. The channel remained open. No response came. Rilis checked the channel every morning. Every morning, there was nothing. Katie Marsh, still living on Outpost Ven, made a decision that most people told her was insane. She bought fuel for her small ship, stocked it with enough food for a month, and flew toward human-controlled space. She was, as far as anyone knew, the first non-military person to attempt contact with humanity since the withdrawal. She crossed the border expecting to find wreckage, debris, some sign of a civilization in retreat. Instead, she found order. Human stations were operational, their lights glowing steady in the dark. Traffic moved between colonies in neat, organized patterns. Sensor arrays swept the space around her the moment she entered, and within minutes, a patrol vessel appeared on her scope. The ship was called the Ridgeline. Its commander was a young officer named Lieutenant Aaron Price. He hailed her with a voice that was calm and professional and completely devoid of hostility. He asked her to identify herself and state her purpose. She told him she was a journalist. She told him she wanted to talk. She told him the galaxy was falling apart, and she wanted to understand why the humans had left. Aaron Price was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ma'am, I appreciate you coming out here, and I mean that, but I can't let you through. This border is closed." Katie asked him if there was any anger, if the humans were punishing the galaxy, if this was revenge. Aaron's voice softened, just slightly, just enough for Katie to hear something in it that made her chest ache. He said, "We're not angry anymore. That's the part they won't understand. We're not punishing anyone. We're not trying to teach anyone a lesson. We're just done. We gave everything we had for 400 years, and it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. So we stopped. That's all." Katie asked if there was any chance they would come back. The line was quiet for a long time. Then Aaron said, "I have a daughter, ma'am. She's 4 years old. She has never once been called inferior. She has never been laughed at for trying to help someone. She sleeps well at night. I'd like to keep it that way." He paused. "Safe travels home." The channel closed. Katie sat in her cockpit, alone in the dark between the stars, and she understood. She understood that this was not anger. This was not pride. This was a species that had been hurt so many times and so deeply that it had finally built a wall, not to keep others out, but to keep its own heart from breaking again. She turned her ship around and flew back to Outpost Ven. She wrote her account that night and published it the next morning. It spread across every network in the galaxy within hours. Billions of beings read Aaron Price's words, and for the first time, the galaxy did not feel anger or fear or confusion. It felt shame. And shame, Katie thought, as she stared at the numbers climbing on her screen, was the first honest thing the galaxy had felt in a very long time. 2 years after the humans left, the galaxy was still alive. Barely. The war between the Thylan and the Valesi had ended, not because anyone had negotiated a peace, but because both sides had simply run out of the will to keep fighting. Their fleets were shattered. Their border worlds were burned. Millions were dead, and the survivors were too tired and too hungry to hold a weapon. They stopped shooting the way a sick animal stops walking. Not by choice, by exhaustion. The Dravari plague had been contained, but not cured. The Dravari government had done the only thing it could, and sealed off infected regions entirely. Hard quarantine. No one in, no one out. Behind those sealed borders, people lived and died with a disease that a human scientist had once held at bay, with a treatment she built in a lab that no longer existed. The official death toll was 9 million. No one wanted to count that high. Trade had partially resumed, but at a fraction of what it used to be. Ships moved through the old lanes carefully, like animals returning to a forest after a fire, sniffing the air, ready to run. Pirate attacks were still common. There were no human patrols to stop them. The Council had tried to build its own peacekeeping fleet, but it was small and poorly trained, and everyone knew it. The galaxy had become a darker, colder, more dangerous place, and the beings who lived in it were beginning to accept that this was simply how things were now. On Athvera, Rillis had sent 47 messages to Earth. She had recorded each one personally. Some were short, some were long. In one of them, she talked for nearly an hour about the history of human-Quori relations, about every kindness, every sacrifice, every moment when a human had reached out a hand and a Quori had failed to reach back. She sent them all into the void, toward Earth space. She received no response to any of them. Not one. She did not stop sending them. On a quiet morning in the Council's second year without humanity, Rillis convened a special session. She did not call it a policy meeting or a strategic review. She called it a remembrance. The delegates filed into the great chamber slowly, many of them new, many of them replacing officials who had resigned or been removed in the chaos of the past 2 years. They sat in their seats and waited, and the chamber was more quiet than it had been in living memory. Cephas stood at the podium. He was thinner than he used to be. The audit had aged him. He held a document that he had spent 6 months compiling, a complete accounting of everything humanity had done for the galaxy during its 400 years of council membership. Every peacekeeping mission, every medical intervention, every infrastructure project, every trade route they protected, every famine they helped prevent, every war they helped stop, every small and invisible act of maintenance and care that had kept the galaxy running while no one watched and no one thanked them. He began to read. He read for 6 hours. He read about human ships that had evacuated alien civilians from war zones while their own crews were under fire. He read about human doctors who had traveled to plague worlds, knowing they might not come back. He read about engineers who had spent their careers on alien stations, far from home, far from their families, fixing things that no one knew were broken until they were fixed. He read about diplomats who had spent decades learning alien languages and alien customs and alien ways of thinking, not because they had to, but because they believed that understanding someone was the first step toward helping them. The chamber was silent the entire time. Some delegates wept. Some simply sat with their heads bowed, unable to look up. Voraf's old seat was empty. No one had taken it. No one wanted to sit where he had sat. When Cephas reached the end of the document, he paused. He looked up from the podium and said, "I added a personal note at the end. I hope the council will forgive me the liberty." He cleared his throat and read the final lines. No species in the history of this council gave more and asked for less, and no species was treated with more contempt for doing so. This is not their shame. It is ours. He stepped down from the podium. No one spoke for a very long time. Rillis proposed the construction of a memorial. Not a monument to humanity, she said, but a monument to the galaxy's failure. A reminder, carved in stone and metal, of what happens when you take kindness for weakness and generosity for obligation. The vote was unanimous. Every single delegate raised their hand. It was the first unanimous vote in the council's history. In her small room on Outpost Ven, Katie Marsh sat at her desk with her headphones on, scanning frequencies the way she did every night. Most of what she picked up was routine traffic, cargo manifests, weather reports from farming worlds, the quiet chatter of a galaxy trying to put itself back together. But that night, her scanner caught something different. It was coming from deep inside human space, a transmission on an open, unencrypted civilian channel. It was not meant for alien ears. It was not meant for anyone, really. It was just life, leaking out through the cracks, the way life always does. She heard a child laughing, a little girl from the sound of it, giggling the way children do when they are being chased around a room. And underneath the laughter, a woman's voice, soft and warm, singing a lullaby. The words were old and simple, the kind of song that mothers have sung to their children since before anyone can remember. Katie could not make out the woman's name. It did not matter. She listened for a long time. She listened to the laughter and the singing and the ordinary beautiful noise of people living their lives in peace. And she felt something break inside her, that she knew would never quite heal. She turned off her equipment. She sat in the dark, and she whispered, to no one, to herself, to the galaxy that would never hear her, "They're not coming back." Far away, on a human colony world called Haven, Nate Caldwell sat on the porch of a small house he had built with his own hands. He was retired now. The USS Starfall had been decommissioned, its hull recycled into building materials for a new school in the town down the road. He didn't miss the ship. He didn't miss the patrols, or the long watches, or the cold silence of deep space. He had given 30 years of his life to protecting people who never knew his name and never wanted to learn it. And now he was done, and he was at peace with that. His daughter, Chloe, was in the yard, chasing fireflies through the tall grass. She was 7 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and she laughed like the world was made of good things. She did not know about the Galactic Council. She did not know about the Fringe Corridor, or the Dravari Plague, or the war that had killed millions. She knew about fireflies and bedtime stories, and the way her father's hand felt when he held hers on the walk to school. Nate watched her run through the grass, her small hands cupping the air, trying to catch the light. He thought about the galaxy he had left behind. He thought about the convoys he had guarded and the people he had saved, and the aliens who had laughed when someone called him a janitor. He waited for the anger to come, the way it used to come in the early days, hot and sharp and hard to swallow. But it didn't come. There was nothing there, not anger, not sadness, not even memory really. Just a quiet space where something used to be, like a room in a house where you no longer live. Chloe caught a firefly. She ran to him, breathless, her hands cupped together, a tiny golden light pulsing between her fingers. "Look, Dad," she said. "Look what I found." He smiled and leaned down to see it. "That's a good one," he said. She grinned and opened her hands, and the firefly floated up into the warm evening air and disappeared among the stars. And that was the terrifying price. Not war, not revenge, not fury, not a fleet darkening the skies of Athvera, not a single shot fired in anger. Just a man on a porch, watching his daughter chase fireflies, not thinking about the galaxy at all. Just a species that had given everything it had, been told it meant nothing, and had quietly, gently, without malice or bitterness, chosen to believe it. The galaxy did not lose humanity to an enemy. It did not lose humanity to a catastrophe or a betrayal or a war. It lost humanity to indifference, its own indifference, reflected back at it like light from a mirror, until the people on the other side simply turned away and found something better to look at. The memorial on Athvera was completed 6 months later. It was a simple structure, a wall of dark stone in the center of the diplomatic quarter, carved with the names of every human who had served the galaxy and received nothing in return. It stretched for 1/4 of a mile. Rillis visited it every morning. She stood before it and read the names and whispered her apologies to people who would never hear them. And out beyond the border, in the quiet and the warmth of 100 colony worlds, humanity lived on. They built schools and planted gardens, and raised their children in the light. They sang songs and told stories, and held each other's hands, and they did not think about the galaxy that had thrown them away. They were not angry. They were not waiting. They were simply, finally, home.